This morning's platform speaker is James White. Jim White has served as leader for both the Essex and Riverdale Yonkers Ethical Societies. He continues to be an active member of the Riverdale Yonkers Society, co-leading both Bronx Climate Justice North and the Congregations for Justice and Peace in Harlem. Jim is a public interest lawyer representing psychiatric patients in northern Manhattan. He is married to the singer Eileen Carlson and has 2 sons and some grandchildren. The title of his talk is Helping Each Other to Change for a World of Peace of Justice in Peace. He will be taking some questions and comments after his talk, so as you're listening to him, you might think of those.
Thank you, Kathleen. And Kathleen, my appreciation for your Lauren Bacall imitation. I'm a lifelong fan of Lauren Bacall. We'll see each other later. Friends, 1,000 thanks for inviting me here today. What a privilege, what a joy to be back. Again, I've lost count, but this is our home centering place and a treasure for all of us. And what a challenge for any speaker this morning. I always look at the front page of the New York Times on Sunday morning before I'm going to speak. Many of you have seen it. Heartbreaking, both the picture of a rally in Phoenix against police killing of Black Latino people, and a vigil in Dallas for the 5 police officers who were killed. Silence is the appropriate approach at this point. I'm going to quote, many of you remember Pete Seeger singing Healing River back in the 60s when, again, there was incredible discord and struggle around the racial injustice that plagues this country and still does. And keeping in mind that healing is not easy and has to come after both analysis and struggle with the cause of the wound, the source of the pain, I will quote Healing River. Send down your waters. Send down your waters on this barren land. O healing river, send down your waters and wash the blood from off the sand. Let us keep silence for a moment, for ourselves, for all who are suffering loss, pain, and for this land we love. So I was up very early this morning to figure how, in the wake of this past week, to recast what I had outlined for us today. Hopefully I'm successful. We'll get through it together. I think a platform is always a joint endeavor. Ethical culture is led equally by lay leaders and professional leaders. So I will watch the clock carefully and finish in plenty of time so that we have some dialogue, so that we can hear each other, share not just our thinking, but our feeling at this arguably pivotal time in our history. But I will begin with what is my elevator moment description of ethical culture, and would like feedback from you about whether this really describes who we are at our best. I like to describe what we're doing to people who don't know us is that we're here helping each other to change for a world of justice and peace. I think we have lived with Felix Adler's admonition that we're here to bring out the best in each other and in ourselves, and I think we try and do that. And we're here to struggle for a more humane world, a world where that dignity and worth that we ascribe to each other by virtue of being human can be more and more realized here and globally. But I use the word change rather than growth, because growth, while it's what we're about, John Lovejoy Elliott once said, the most wonderful thing in the world is that there is growth, and ain't it the truth? But what's a little tougher to face is that growth requires change. And change, pretty tough. It means looking in the mirror. It means listening to others who point out to you where you're doing okay and where you're missing the mark. One of our most exciting efforts in Congregations for Justice and Peace, the small, feisty interfaith justice and peace group that Ann Clayson helped me begin a few years ago now, is our monthly justice and peace meeting that we lovingly call Miriam for Hebrew scriptures, Mark for Christian scriptures, and Marx for Carl. Well, that usually gets attention. And, there's some Marxists there who are really cool and feisty, and they tolerate the scriptural stuff we do for about 3 or 4 minutes into the meeting. And then we get down to business of applying what we've heard and learned to the struggle for justice and peace. So, change. I've been leading that for some years, and, we now have between 15 and 20, among them very seasoned leaders in the quest for justice and peace, and real newcomers, young folks, wonderful. So we have a leadership evaluation meeting, and one of our young folks led the discussion last month, and it was pointed out to me, Jim, that she did a great job, and that she actually facilitated more people coming out with good comments and questions than I do. Does that mean I have to change? Yeah, and part of the change is let Shanika do it more and more often. Was this chagrining for someone who's been trying to do this since the spring of 1967, modestly? Yes. But facing up to the helpful evaluation of colleagues in the trenches in the struggle for justice and peace is helping me to change. I'll keep you posted. I'll let you know what they say in 3 or 4 or 5 months. So I began what I wrote for your website with a question. Can we have ethical culture without ethical action? What do you think? No. Good answer. Yeah. It's impossible. Absolutely impossible. Because when that young former rabbi-to-be, Felix Adler, convened us in 1876, it was at the height of the robber barons robbing. It was at the moment that the federal government was selling out former enslaved people, withdrawing from the South. Huge exploitation, racial injustice, oppression, child labor, you name it, it was all there in 1876. And young Felix, in chartering this movement on that wonderful May night, was coming out of a tradition that gloried in Abraham Lincoln's emancipation, that gloried in the horrific carnage of the Civil War for what it could bring, and when he was in Europe, through his professor of Immanuel Kant studies, this bothered his father, of course, but they developed a good relationship. Felix Adler learned from the labor movement in Europe in the 1860s and 70s, and particularly from a book called The Labor Question. And I wish I could remember the German, because it sounds so much more authoritative auf Deutsch, but I forgot it. In any case, he frequently cited this text and his understanding of the labor movement there and in the United States as the most critical ethical question facing decent, caring people in this country. And he never backed off from that. Now, given the horror that we've been going through this week, in the past months, years really, obviously, since 2011, the reality of racist division and oppression has become clearer and clearer to us. And that wasn't quite so clear to Adler and his first folks Their main focus was on exploited, oppressed immigrant people. But keep in mind, immigrant people in the 19th century themselves were characterized as racially inferior. I am part Irish, happy to say, and I forget what part, but some of my ancestors here were known as, quote, Black Irish. They were oppressed and exploited as subhuman, as were my wife's Eastern European Jewish ancestors coming here after 1900. So an understanding of the need to unify, to respect equally, to move forward in unity was with our ethical movement from the beginning. And Felix set the tone for that. So whenever I give a talk like this, and Anne said it'd be really cool for ethical leaders to talk about our history and what is unique in what we do as ethical culturists, and I'm all for that. But I usually do that by going through a lot of quotes and, kind of brushing them up in 21st century language, just to highlight where we've been from 1876 to 1902 to 1912 to 1930, so on. I'm not going to do that today. What I want to do, if you'll indulge me, is share a much more personal journey of my encounters with ethical culture. And they began with understanding ethical as fraught with ethical language, action. Now, we can learn this from all of our books. I mean, hopefully, most of you have read Adler, Horace Freese, his son-in-law, Ed Erickson, Howard Radis, Joe Schumann. We've got to do much better in getting in final form our women leaders who write as eloquently. Your own Anne, Anna Garland Spencer, Joan Lewis, Lisa Burns, Martha Gallagher. All of this writing must be put in book form so that it can be much more accessible. People tell me online is more accessible. But sisters and brothers, I'm so 20th century, I don't do line very well. I admit that. You just can't cuddle up with a laptop the way you can with a book, can you? Whatever. Other 20th century people here may identify with me on this. Only Betty Levin, who's met Betty Levin from the Essex Society? Judy knows Betty. Betty has written and recently published an incredible memoir called Becoming Betty. And Betty is a lifelong ethical culturalist, and every page of that memoir reflects what her aunt introduced her to, I think, at the age of 11 in the Chicago Society. So the book Becoming Betty really should become one of our books, routinely read and enjoyed. We celebrated her 90th back in the spring, and what a celebration that was. Anyway, so let's start to fight to get our women leaders' writings into more permanent, accessible form and learn from them. That said, I'm going to share my own encounter with the ethical movement as a young guy, a college freshman, callow, not quite so innocent, in October of 1966. The question I ask myself often is, how have I been led to change because of my encounter with and trying to practice ethical culture? I suggest each of us ask ourselves that question. What are we doing for a world of justice and peace? And how is that changing us? How is that bringing out new and undiscovered qualities, helping us not just to grow, but to change every day going forward as ethical humanists? So, my life's transforming encounter with ethical culturists occurred with Jerry Frank. Anyone remember Jerome David Frank from Baltimore and Johns Hopkins? I'll just bring you up to date on him. So I was dating his daughter, Deborah. She also was a college freshman. And Jerry and Liza came to visit that October. And he took me to a great French dinner and then sat down and bent my ear about ethical culture for about 3 hours. What an incredible experience. Jerry was at that time a professor of psychology and psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. More especially, he was on the board of sane nuclear policy, and having gone through 1962 and the terror of nuclear annihilation, When Debbie told me what her dad was doing, wow, was I excited about that. But more to the point, given what we're facing this week and currently, Jerry and Liza had helped to found the Baltimore Ethical Society. And the Ethical Culture Society in Baltimore was the first racially integrated organization in that old slave state of Maryland. And what an impact that had, not just in Maryland, but nationally and on the movement. For some years, I served on the AEU membership committee with Dale Adams. Does anyone remember meeting Dale Adams? Imagine having to be an ethical culturalist as an African American in Chattanooga, Tennessee. She managed to do it. And she managed to chair the National Membership Committee when we were setting our goals on growth and diversity. And she did a magnificent job, and her experience in helping to found the Baltimore Ethical Society, she said, was absolutely foundational to her life. So at that point, I was on the liberal Episcopal priest track dating this wonderful Jewish ethical culture woman, and I hear about ethical culture. And I hear, you can believe a number of different creeds, but unite on common ground in trying to help each other improve and to change the world. I said, I could do that too. And date incredibly interesting Jewish women also. And lo and behold, 6 years later, I met one and married her, and that's been really cool as well. But the point is that Jerry set my mind on ethical culture as a movement, as an alternative to being an Episcopal priest, which I wound up not doing. My wife should get a medal for saving the church from me. I work with Episcopalians very happily. But something, to think about making a life's work in, because I'd always thought I would be some kind of pastor. Lawyer came a lot later. So, when we moved to Teaneck in 1982 with our first kid and had our second, Eileen vaguely knew about ethical culture, but I had always grown up in congregations, had been active in Sunday schools, and I really wanted my sons to be active. We had come to the Riverdale Yonkers Society for a year when I was in law school and had a good experience there. But when we got to Teaneck, we were really ready to make a commitment to an ethical congregation and raise our sons in that. And was that incredibly life-transforming for us. We started immediately working on the Bergen Sanctuary Committee. You may remember in the 1980s, immigrants from Central America were coming here desperate to escape the incredible violence launched by Ronald Reagan in his crusade against communism in Central America. So we, in our society, debated for a year about whether we would take the risk to move forward and illegally harbor a refugee. And we found ways to do that with respect. So I began to see ethical as a real vital focus for ethical action, and also I found out there was a leadership training program. So I bought an ethical philosophy of life. All of you have read all of it, right? Please think of doing it. It's not easy going, but it's life transforming. So the second encounter I had with ethical culture was curled up on my sofa in Teaneck in February of 1985, reading Felix Adler from cover to cover. And I got a sense that this guy really got it in terms of balancing the individual as sacred and the community as sacred, in terms of identifying the spiritual as this world-oriented, in terms of creating an ongoing community of faith that would unite people of different theological or non-theological backgrounds in doing the work of the world. And as luck would have it, I was accepted in leadership training and moved forward to be able to help lead the Essex Society. That was my third encounter. In Essex, they were so tolerant. They really shaped this callow, wordy, over and under educated guy who was also trying to represent psychiatric patients, and that has been a less stress and wonder as well. And they shaped me into a leader. I began to veer from writing ponderous text with too many semicolons to working from outlines, as Al Black did. Arthur Dobrin assured me of that, and moving forward on one of the most vital anti-racist issues of the day, and tragically, it still is. You're aware of the incredible disparity of funding at the state level for inner city schools versus suburban schools. And this has been litigated in New York and New Jersey, and at least twice the highest courts of New York and New Jersey said, yeah, this is illegal. This violates the 14th Amendment. This terribly discriminates against young people of color. This has to end. Sisters and brothers, has it yet ended? No. It really hasn't. I was marching in Brooklyn yesterday with a wonderful African American from the Bronx, who is a special ed teacher in the Bronx, recounting where she has materials that she has to buy herself or actually gets funded, and how she was forced into doing special ed when she really was not prepared to do that at any level, simply because of the lack of funding in New York City schools. So we move forward in Essex, Maplewood, South Orange, and Newark to create the Urban-Suburban Equal Education Committee. That comes together as USEEK, which is a lot easier to say. And we organized a large march from the suburbs into Newark, headed by the chair of the New York schools at that point, and we loaded school buses full of parents and teachers to go down to Trenton to testify to the Senate committee that presided over funding. We got some incremental changes and improvements, but still the imbalance of funding for young people of color as opposed to suburban kids is stark and absolutely obscene. Still in all, we forged ties with suburbanites and inner city people over those 6 years I was in Maplewood, and that began to change me as well, because I learned from their leadership what staying the course in the trenches meant, what having grit under oppression would mean, what caring for kids in practice meant in terms of organizing. So fast forward, I was able in Harlem, when I retired from Essex, to start working in a soup kitchen at St. Mary the Militant. I love that little church. It's really not like any Episcopal church you've ever met. And I found that the people there, third African American, 2/3 actually, and a third the rest of us, had a tradition of activism. And so when the Twin Towers were attacked in September of 2001, we pulled together a conference that we called Congregations for Justice and Peace, because we knew the response to that would be pretty horrific. And through the years, that modest ecumenical group has grown to still modest numbers, but regular activity and struggle in Harlem. And in the fall of 2003, Ann Clayson helped us create an incredible conference at Riverside Church, which was aimed at heading off an invasion of Iraq. And Kathleen, you're right, that was wrong. And we didn't succeed, but I got to know Ann, and I got to understand her trove of experience and commitment. And that gave an incredible push to moving forward this interracial interfaith organization that I'm privileged to be a part of now. And then finally, Riverdale Yonkers needed a leader. So Joe Schuman put me onto that. They, perhaps unwisely, chose me. And the issue of climate change was really the most important focus they had had. They were leading the fight against fracking in Riverdale and in the Bronx. And so we organized for the People's Climate March. How many people were able to do the climate march here in the city? Was that an incredible experience or what? Truly amazing. And out of that experience, we came together as what emerged as Bronx Climate Justice North. So we've had a modest success since, and In terms of racial justice, we have focused on frontline communities, the people of color who are hurt first and worst in terms of climate change. Look at Hurricane Katrina, look at Hurricane Sandy. In Manhattan, we're still helping one family that was shattered in the Rockaways from Hurricane Sandy. And the past year, we have pulled together 3 different programs in the Bronx. The one I'm most active in is the Food Justice Group, and we organize support for rural migrant ministries fighting and marching for the Farm Workers' Rights Bill, which is still pending in Albany, and we need to put more effort on that. But in the process, we made coalition with an African American church in Marble Hill and a Latino church in Kingsbridge. And this is something that people in Riverdale have been dreaming of since way before I came, and something that now is beginning to bear fruit, really incredibly, and with great potential. So, what are our roots in terms of understanding the oppression of racism and the need to move forward in solidarity with our sisters and brothers of color to do that? Ann Clayson wrote an incredibly beautiful description of NACP and the roots of unethical culture. And I'm not going to read all of that because it's online, and I suggest you all go back to that. It cites that in the first week of January in 1909, one of our leaders here at the New York Society, Dr. Henry Moskowitz, it's not a well-known name. Who's heard of Henry? I hadn't until I read this. But he met with the Unitarian Mary White Ovington and William English Walling, a journalist, in the wake of a horrible race riot in Springfield, Illinois, the previous year, that among others, like Tulsa throughout the country, had attacked and murdered a number of African American people. And they came out of this with the call for a conference on Lincoln's birthday, and the call indicated by Mary Ovington White, the spirit of abolitionism must be revived. This is 1909. So, Oswald Garrison Villiard, does Garrison ring a bell? William Lloyd, the great abolitionist, he was his grandson. He was president of the New York Evening Post, and he put out this call on Lincoln's birthday. And then that coming May, 53 signers of the proposed conference made the first conference leading to the NACP the following year happen. And of those signers were Jane Addams, who was a regular lecturer in Chicago and nationally for ethical culture, Walter Salter, who was leader in Chicago, Henry Moskowitz here, and our own John Lovejoy Elliott. These were 4 of the leading signers. They had the meeting at Cooper Union beginning on May 30th, 1909. The men and women engaged in religious, social, and educational work for the first time met the Negro who demand not a pittance, but full rights in the Commonwealth. And they said they did not want to leave this meeting. Have you ever been in a meeting about an activist issue that was so charged, so focused, so timely, that you didn't want to leave? That really says it all. And the following year, the NACP was formed. Now, Felix Adler was not silent in this at all. As I indicated, labor rights were his chief interest, and child labor rights his chief accomplishment in the bill that finally got through Congress after decades and decades. He developed what was called the Plymouth School of Applied Ethics around labor exploitation in 1892. But more importantly, we have to remember he helped to organize the first Universal Racist Conference at the University of London in 1911, over 4 days. W.B. Du Bois and Felix Adler were both delegates at that conference. One of the main goals was to point out the absurdity of the belief prevalent among the peoples of the world that their customs, their civilization, their physique, are superior to those of other peoples, and deprecate the looseness with which the term race is often employed. The New York Society went on to provide a platform for prominent leaders like Du Bois, like Booker T. Washington, and as well as James Weldon Johnson. And do remember that Johnson himself was a member here for 15 years. I did not know that until I researched this talk. And I don't need to go through the incredible list on the back of your program of all the things the New York Society has done for racial justice from that time forward. It is exemplary, and in 1949, Eleanor Roosevelt told a membership meeting here, "I think you have probably, more than any other group in the city, done more to better conditions between the various races within the city." A very great achievement indeed. So we're going to need some time for dialogue. I won't spend more than 5 or 6 minutes to bring us up to the tragic date that we're at. And we have to face what we must do now in the face of that tragedy. I've listed the high-profile killings by police of people of color. And from James Powell, July 16, 1964, which sparked the Harlem Rebellion of 1964, through Oscar Grant, January 1st, 2009 in California, I counted 9 very high-profile cases. Horrible, but 9. We remember Eleanor Bumpurs, Amadou Diallo, Alberta Sproul, Sean Bell. 9. Okay. That's over 42 years. But since November 19th in White Plains, when Kenneth Chamberlain was killed by police, and our ethical society in White Plains has done a great deal of work with his family. From November 19th, 2011 to July 6th, 2016, when Philandro Castillo was killed. 22 in 5 years. Why now? Why in these 5 years has this become so much more incredibly obvious? I have some ideas. I'd love some feedback from you, but I think the main point is that it has become incredibly pervasive, that we know that police have been killing people of color, arguably 2 times a week, the National Lawyers Guild has estimated. And now the Washington Post is keeping an account of killings. And so far in 2016, as of 2 days ago, 509 people have been killed in this country this year by police. And hugely, disproportionately, people of color. And of these, I've counted 26 were black, 4 were Latino, 1 was Jewish. You may remember Gideon Bush, the psychiatrically compromised Orthodox man in Brooklyn. We worked with his family some years ago. So, if we are trying to help each other to change for a world of justice and peace, what does that mean in the face of this emerging horror? Each death, individual death, of someone we ascribe worth and dignity, police and people of color, each is a tragedy. But the disproportion of numbers of police killed, I totaled, I think, 64 in the past year, 28 by actions regarding suspects only, as opposed to the numbers of people of color. Incredible disparity. We mourn each, but we have to look at the horrible injustice in the differences. What does a one-sentence description, helping each other to change for a world of justice and peace, what does that call us to do at our best? And personally, how have I been changed? Being privileged in a modest way to work in this area. I mentioned Jerry Frank. he prompted me to do work in a housing project in Boston, and I met Zandrina Young, an incredible African-American parent who was organizing families and young people in Columbia Point. When I came to Essex, Susan Rose was one of the first we met. Susan Rose Teshu, she was our leader. Betty Levin, I've mentioned. Houston Stevens, an incredible parent activist, and Margaret Brown, a leader of anti-racist work there. Joe Schuman, an incredibly inspiring leader to this day in Bergen. And along with him, when Philip Pinnell was killed in 1990, Michelle March, Lorna and Paul Cunningham, Bo Meyerson, all of them working for cohesion and mutual support as TNEC came apart. Then, as I mentioned, in Harlem, Ann Clayson, Sherelle Patterson, Lawrence Roberts, April Jackson, incredible laborers in unassuming ways and assuming in good ways to create congregations for justice and peace. And finally, in the Bronx, Jennifer Scarlett, Mary Hemmings, two members of RISEC, Nathaniel Dixon, the African-American pastor that we're working with now, and his cohort, Dorothy Shepard, around food justice issues. The collection today will go in part to the Kingsbridge, Riverdale, Marble Hill Food and Hunger Project that RISEC began back in the 1980s, when homelessness and hunger became obvious to Dr. Furman, who was treating malnourished children at Montefiore. The food justice effort is something we're struggling to expand, and we're helping to do that today. So, yes, in this time of incredible stress, sadness, let us mourn, let us reflect, but then, as we did earlier, let us lift every voice and sing in hope. And as James Weldon Johnson has told us, let us march on until victory is won.